Revisiting a castle in northern Germany, George Ball, advisor to two presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, a principal architect of American foreign policy since the war. In 1945, George Ball headed the American Strategic Bombing Survey. Germany was about to surrender. The war against Japan remained unfinished. To know how best to finish it quickly, Ball's intelligence services were looking for one man, Albert Speer. This is where they found him. Hugh Trevor-Roper, now a distinguished Oxford Don, was then in British intelligence. For him, too, Albert Speer was the man to see for the reconstruction of the last days of Hitler. Albert Speer himself is back home today in Heidelberg after 20 years in prison. Trevor-Roper has pinpointed the basic fascination about him. How is it that so intelligent a man either did not see, or if he did see, was able to accept the criminality of Adolf Hitler's regime?
Und links und rechts die Hunderttausende und Millionen von Volksgenossen sah, aus all unserem Betrieb und Werkstätten, aus unseren Fabriken und Kontors und Büros, da ist mir das Herz so aufgegangen, da habe ich so recht gefühlt, das ist unser Deutschland, das ist unser Volk, unser herrliches deutsches Volk und unser liebes deutsches Reich.
As Hitler's architect, Speer personally stage-managed spectacles like the Cathedral of Ice, using over 400 searchlights, great tableaus of adulation and mass hysteria in which Hitler bathed at the Nazi Party rallies, backdrops for the rise of a tyrant. Speer became an intimate personal friend of Hitler at the time he seized power. To the young, intelligent, ambitious architect, Hitler gave patronage and unlimited possibilities, backed by the power to execute his dreams. Together, they strode into Paris behind victorious German armies. Albert Speer, architect and friend, was commissioned to build for Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. He would design buildings on a scale which matched Hitler's dreams of conquest, to dwarf Napoleon's Paris. Berlin would become capital of the Western world, rebuilt on a scale which taxes belief. A dome to crown the new city would stand 900 feet high, in all 14 times the size of St. Peter's in Rome. Its corridors would be half a mile long. This is what the 1,000-year Reich would look like. Hitler himself sketched this triumphal arch, 33 times as big as the Arc de Triomphe. The Allied bombers crumbled the visions into dust. They leveled the old order, and with it dreams of the new order, with its great soulless monoliths. While the bombers were accomplishing this, Hitler intuitively promoted his architect to take charge of all German war production. Albert Speer was only 37 when he got the job of running Germany's war economy. He toured the blitzed factories, organizing and exhorting. With no previous experience, he demonstrated the remarkable powers of organization which so intrigued Allied intelligence after Germany's collapse. Despite the mounting severity of the air raids, Speer achieved striking increases in production, without which Hitler could never have continued the war.
Steig hoch, steig hoch.
Germany's war factories were also sustained on the backs of armies of slaves, millions taken in cattle trucks to Germany to work like cattle. This was not Speer's direct responsibility, but his association with this black, inhuman chapter earned him a sentence of 20 years at Nuremberg. Even in 1944, with Allied bombing at its height, Speer's 14 million workers continued to provide more armaments than Germany's crumbling armies could use. But despite increased production, when the Allied bombers switched to sustained attacks on the synthetic oil plants, they slowly paralyzed the war economy, and collapse was coming. In their cities, Germans were either dead, homeless, or demoralized. In July 1944, the German people contemplated only mounting ruin. The handful of men in the resistance took action. Count Klaus von Stauffenberg plants a bomb in a briefcase beside Hitler at his headquarters. The Führer miraculously survives. Albert Speer has no part in this, and yet soon he'll try to kill Hitler himself. Russians from the east, the Allies from the west, pour into Germany. Hitler orders demolitions to be carried out on a massive scale, the last act of manic vengeance because he says the German people are unworthy of him. Speer openly opposes Hitler's orders for the final destruction of Germany. He's watched Nazism and Hitler with growing disenchantment, and until now has turned a blind eye to their corruptions. Even now, he doesn't desert Hitler, but with the Russians on the outskirts, flies back into besieged Berlin. And here he takes a personal farewell of Hitler. A few days before the Russians break in, he finds Hitler, the man for whom he traded his soul, a palsied, broken wreck. And so Speer came to trial at Nuremberg.
Ich kenne mich nicht schuldig.
Albert Speer. Nicht schuldig.
Norman Burkitt, the British judge, said later that Albert Speer was the only one for whom he had any sympathy. Speer was not implicated in the crimes of the SS, but he accepted personally a collective moral guilt for the Nazi period. He was sentenced to 20 years, long years of self-examination in prison. Albert Speer, Hugh Trevor-Roper, and George Ball have not seen each other since the war. They now meet again for the first time in 26 years in a Munich studio.
I feel that the period of your power is separated by a gulf which must be very emphatic to you after this great activity and great prominence, to have this long period of enforced meditation. And I imagine that you look back across this gulf with a certain objectivity towards a remote life. And I would like to ask what you read in prison. Did you read much?
Yes, we had every possibility to read all the books available in the central library of Berlin town, and it was really a very good library. And I could read everything, novels, English novels, French novels, and I could read books of history. I could read philosophy, psychology, and also things. And but we were not allowed to read books about our time, so I couldn't read your book, for instance, but it was smuggled in.
So you weren't able to give, as it were, an outside dimension to your own experiences?
Well, afterwards, when after 7 years, we had a chance to read 4 newspapers, and these 4 newspapers were only censored when it was something in which was concerning our personal life in Spandau. So then I read a lot of things about the time in which I was minister, now reflected by the new time. But as I said, not the books I would have liked to read, But there were some warders nice enough to provide me now and then, when there was no Russian present, with one of the new books. And, but it wasn't the time to read them thoroughly, but just to skip them through.
20 years in prison. 20 years is a long time to think. Why didn't that alter your perspectives? Because the point is that throughout the book you say almost exactly the same things you said in your interrogations in 1945. Mm-hmm. Did nothing change for you in prison?
Your remarks are to me a little bit astonishing, because I was of the opinion that I couldn't have written this book as it is without all what I read in Spandau prison. I often mention that this man who wrote the book after '66 was a changed man, and he only was able to write it on a higher standard because I had read so much and had now a wider circle of seeing and thinking.
Throughout your memoirs, you give an impression, a very strong impression, of the dilettantism of Hitler's court. And you give a very vivid picture of the intrigues at Hitler's court and the personalities. But the history of Nazism isn't only the history of personalities competing at court, or what they individually as ministers did politically. Mm-hmm. There is also this phenomenon which lies behind the whole Nazi experiment, and compared with which the dilettantism seems to me relatively trivial, what we can call the SS state. Mm-hmm. This gigantic organization that was controlled, in fact, by Himmler, which provided the force on which the political superstructure rested. And of that underworld, you say in your book almost nothing. Mm-hmm. I merely am astonished at the lack of any reference to this world of terror, which was the essential condition of the whole political system within which you worked, within which you and the other members of the court competed for power at the center. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That staggers me.
Yeah, because you are seeing it from outside. If one sees it from inside, when you are living inside such a system, Malraux has in his Musée Imaginaire, he says, a fish can't see the outside of his aquarium. And I think that is one of the things which are very wise. Because if you are inside such a thing, you don't see and you don't feel what really is happening. You are so in a world that this to describe that it's that things are getting normal to you, which are absolutely abnormal to somebody who's seeing it from outside.
You mean you in effect take it for granted?
Pardon?
You take it for granted, the conditions that exist. I mean, these acquire a kind of normality because you become so used to them. Is this what you're suggesting?
It was not normal, was it? Mm-hmm. No, it may have become normal by 1945, but it grew. The final solution was only declared in 1941. You had been with Hitler for 10 years when that happened. Mm-hmm. How can one regard this apparatus of terror and persecution in one's own country happening, caused by a government of which one is a courtier at the very center?
Yeah, but you know that the final solution was a secret, and it was a secret to me too. I just now, for preparing our discussion, I was reading through the table talks the first time of Hitler's, and I just was seeing if there was some remark about the Jews which would be obviously hinting to the final solution, but I didn't find any. And so possibly it was when I was sitting together with Hitler, he didn't say any word about the final solution. Of course, he certainly made hateful remarks about the Jews, as they are in the table talks, but not more. And it's very difficult to find out such a secret even if you are in the government. That's it's a problem.
We knew about it in England. 2 years, we knew the details of what was going on in Auschwitz, apparently before you did. Is that not surprising?
No, that's not surprising at all, because you had about 300,000 prisoners in this time, and certainly some of the prisoners, they were talking about it. As you found out about Peenemünde, only by one prisoner. And Peenemünde was kept a secret in Germany too, not to me, of course, but it was kept a secret.
There must have been a great number of Germans who were engaged indirectly in the organization of concentration camps. Himmler's vast empire must have been known at the center?
No, I don't know, but I doubt that they knew, because this was a separation of power, and it was this order of Hitler that nobody should tell anybody which is not concerned about anything which he doesn't need knowing.
But I thought that you are prepared to admit that you knew about Auschwitz,
but
didn't pursue your inquiries to discover the dimensions of what was
No,
happening.
no,
I mean,
no,
surely
no.
you knew about Auschwitz in
No, that's
1943.
I didn't write that. I said I could have known, because Hanke, he told me, not mentioning the name of Auschwitz, but he could have, I could have known if I would have asked, and his hint was so that something is happening somewhere in Upper Silesia, which is really which is to him so exciting that he almost didn't find the words. But it wasn't not more. And of course, I say now that was my biggest mistake, not to ask. Nowadays, I don't remember so in details more than I was writing down in Spandau when I was describing this scene. But certainly he was excited, and he said, never go in a concentration camp in Upper Silesia. There are horrible things are happening there. That must have been about the sense of what he was saying.
When you were working within this system, obviously you became aware, if you weren't immediately, that Hitler's long-term objectives were world dominion. I think it's perfectly clear on the record that this was in fact the case, and I've been rather amazed actually at the extent to which he made this clear in conversations, in what he said, what he wrote during the period that he was in power. In other words, you envisaged the possibility that you might play a central or important role in a Germany which would really dominate the world. This, I suppose, was implicit, too, in the kind of architectural conceptions that you had, because these were the architectural conceptions of a capital which is the world capital. Now, how did you conceive that a state that was dominated by a single dictator, which was a cruel state, which was a selfish state, how could you conceive that it could possibly succeed to maintain a world dominance, even granted that it once achieved it?
Well, in this time, I was so glad to be the architect and to do this work, and said, even if I thought about, which is doubtful, thought about the cruelties of the system, then I put it aside, because I thought that this is the chance of my lifetime, to be the architect for a state who is making steps for world dominion, and which and my buildings will be for centuries the buildings which are proclaiming or testifying this time.
Yeah, you've said that in your memoirs you seek to present your experiences without commentary, leaving the reader to impose the interpretation. Is that right?
I didn't do always.
No,
but many exceptions.
Now, I, as a reader, have tried to understand your story May I tell you how I understand it? You will tell me if I am right, because it's still, my understanding still leaves me with questions. It seems to me that at the beginning, as you have just said, you saw this great opportunity of patronage as an architect. Here was a patron who was a very powerful man, and perhaps you adopted towards him the attitude which artists have adopted in the past towards great political patrons, and they have said, we will accept the patronage of the Medici, or whoever it might be, or the Sultan of Turkey, and build great mosques, and we are not committed to the particular politics which is this subject of politicians. That seems to me an attitude which could hypothetically be adopted. It seems, on your showing, the attitude which you did adopt when you went in the beginning. So I can understand your coming into dependence on Hitler, but I can't understand, at least I can't easily understand, your acceptance of the change which you admit that you saw. You saw by 1939 that the whole program had changed. And when Hitler declared war in 1939, one of the remarks which surprised me by its frankness as well as by its content was when you say in this book that you were in favor of the war, that here were all the others, Goebbels, Goering, and the rest had cold feet. They were frightened, and they didn't want war. And you said that you and some others thought that they were cowardly, and that now was the great moment when the war of aggression should begin, and it was cowardly of them to value their privileges rather than risk them in this great and noble gamble. That seems to me a very surprising remark.
Of course, I knew when I was writing this down that I was in favor of the war, that this is a point which will be criticized very much. But I think it's necessary for historians to know that a man like me was in favor of war, and it was not only recklessness, it was some kind of, well, maybe the word is adventure or such a thing of a young man. I was then 39, I was then 34, to risk something, to have a risky life, a change after such long period of peacetime, and all such things. So I would say that this that's of course today to me it's very astonishing and it's embarrassing and I feel ashamed of it, but it's necessary to note that it was so in this time.
So it would be fair to say that in 1939, having seen what you might interpret as a transformation in Hitler, or you might interpret as a mere revelation of his real purpose, but nevertheless, having seen that his plan was a robber empire in Europe, to put it bluntly, having seen this, nevertheless, you said a robber empire will give me an even greater area, more resources, bigger buildings, bigger patronage, greater glory. I shall be the architect of the new Alexander the Great, or the new Napoleon. But then a moment comes in the war when defeat is visible to you, though not to everyone else, because you understand more profoundly than they do the technical basis of war. And Germans start deserting Hitler. They start saying it is better to destroy Hitler, to make peace now before it is too late. And you, to put it bluntly, are the last to draw these, although you are the first to draw the conclusion that the war is lost, you are the last to detach yourself.
There are 2 points. One point is we forget that Hitler was obviously a person which has shown not only tremendous willpower, but also a kind of a gift of magnetism. Of course, I don't want to use it as an excuse, as I see it now, being out of this world. It looks rather ridiculous for a man with a high education to be succumbing to such magnetism, what else it was. And the second point is, I mentioned it several times in speeches. I ended my speeches as a war minister, never with the normal routine ending, we are fighting for the national socialist government or country or our ideas, but I was just saying we do our best to provide our sons and our fathers and our brothers with the weapons which are necessary. And this is very difficult if armies are fighting, difficult for the generals and everybody who is concerned, even for Stauffenberg or Olbricht, which I knew quite well, which were also trying to do as much as possible, to get as much weapons as possible, even in the time when they were already on the way to plot against Hitler, to get as much weapons done as possible. And that was my own way too. I remember my last talks with Olbricht and Stauffenberg was just a few weeks before the plot of 20th of July. And there was still the question, and I think it was serious from their part, what can we do to get as much weapons as possible? And then this fact that I was on the list of this government of the 20th of July also shows they didn't do it because they liked me, but possibly they did it because they thought he's an able man, and at least for a while he will be the best man to provide us with as much weapons as we can
yes,
get.
I can see the argument for going on providing the weapons in order to preserve the position from which to negotiate. But I cannot see how to combine that with loyal support to a dictator who had by this time shown that he was never going to give up power, that attempts to influence him were in vain, that he remained permanently in control of politics, and that his policy was disastrous.
Yeah.
As well as being
well, as a historian, you're absolutely right. As a human being, I have only excuses I can offer you, but I have no real reasonable things to tell you. The one excuse is that this system of Hitler's to separate each one from the other one and to say one is only responsible for his own task. That was a kind of education which is going back possibly also before Hitler's time. We're speaking about technocrats nowadays, and that's one of these problems which was in Hitler's government developed to a level which was maybe much more than we can think about nowadays. I compare it sometimes because you can't. Somebody who wasn't in this aquarium, he can't realize how it was. But if you are nowadays in a big firm like General Electric or so, or in the army, which are authoritarian systems, it's possible that not the same, of course, things may happen, but also that people who are not satisfied with what the chief is doing, then saying, well, let him do, I just am concerned about my own branch and try to do the best on my own branch.
Albert Speer said at Nuremberg, "Insofar as Hitler had a friend, I should certainly have been his close friend." It was Hitler's passion for architecture which made a meeting more or less inevitable. Speer had joined the Nazi Party before it seized power. He had heard Hitler speak and found him spellbinding. A meeting with Hitler produced a commission to rebuild the old Reich Chancellery. My position as Hitler's architect soon became indispensable to me, Speer says. Not even 30, I saw before me the most exciting prospects an architect can dream of.
From the point of view of just let me say that from the point of view of anyone in my country, or I think in Great Britain, who had the experience of seeing motion pictures of Hitler and hearing him on the radio and seeing the things that he wrote, the communiques that he issued, the statements that he made, the speeches that he made, it was totally incomprehensible to us how anyone could find a particular charm in this man. And again, by your own accounts in your book, those very, very dreary, sterile social evenings at the Berghof. How do you explain this? This is the ultimate mystery, I think, as far as we're concerned.
Yes, and it goes through the whole book, because even when I was for periods free of his influence, then I came back in his influence again. Then I was thrown out again by something, and then I came back again. And then even in the end, I was working against his scorched earth policy. But I visited him then in the last days in his bunker. It's only explainable when you agree with me that persons can have a kind of really magnetism, or can hypnotize their people, and you try to get out of this influence, but you are in their you depend on them.
What sort of an image do you have? What do you see when you hear his name mentioned?
Now, or in this time?
Yes.
Now. Well, now I think I feel that he did so much harm to the world and to Germany and to us that it's out of any question how to think about him.
But what mental picture do you have of him? Do you see him in uniform at the height of his powers in the 30s, or do you see him in decline in the bunker just before his suicide?
I don't see him at all. I don't remember him in this way. He doesn't disturb my thoughts or my dreams or so. In any case, that's finished to me.
But we've now been talking of him for a few seconds. Now recall a picture of him. What do you see?
Well, I must reconstruct it, because I didn't see anything personally so impersonal now to me, so far away. But if I would think back, I think I would see him in the first time when he was my colleague as architect, because that was a more impressive thing than afterwards. As a minister, he was farther away from me. There was much more distance between us, and he, in his personality, was no more so close to me.
Where did you have your most interesting private moments with Hitler? You paint a picture in the book of these excruciatingly boring tea parties on the Obersalzburg, in the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, not far from us here in Munich. You make that look almost intolerably boring. So where did you have your private moments which were of such value to you?
Well, it was when I was together with him over the plans, over the drawings, or when he was with other architects together and was correcting their plans. And it was remarkable how quick he could grasp the meaning of a plan, how he was able to think in 3 dimensions, which most people who are reading plans can't, and how his memory was enabled him to think about corrections he made months ago in some drawings, and now he got it from his architect, and he said, "No, I didn't say so. I made it so." And so it was. This was amazing to me, because he was the head of the state and he had many other worries and grievances, and still he could deal with such small details on his private field.
Was he always excited, or was he more relaxed at this time? Was he aggressive?
As when he was acting as an architect, he was really very much relaxed, and he was at his ease, and he was not raging, you could contradict him or tell him that I don't think that is right, and so that was the privilege of his architects to contradict him.
It was architecture too, which I think from the book provided you with the first and most obvious opportunity to leave Hitler, because it threw up the first, what should have been, I think you probably admit in the book, properly should have awakened your moral conscience. When you were sent to redesign the offices of the Vice-Chancellor, von Papen, and on the carpet in the building which was being torn down under your orders to be rebuilt, you saw the bloodstain where von Papen's staff had been murdered by Hitler's men. Can you explain that today? Why you didn't see then that a criminal was in power?
I can't give an explanation of my own, because now I'm perhaps a changed man from this time, but in this time I just was looking away, and this was always the same thing. I was always following this line of somebody who is not concerned if it doesn't involve in his own matters. If it would have happened to a colleague of mine, to an architect, possibly I would have reacted otherwise. But so I thought, well, it's not up to me, that's state affairs. And I want to be frank about that. We don't come to the point if I would make evasions about these things. It was just like that.
What do you think of those buildings now when you see them, that you designed?
Well, I'm glad that they weren't built.
You've spoken of them as pure decadence in art. Is that a judgment you arrived at in prison, or before that?
The start was already before, when I was in Spain in '41 and have seen the Escorial built by the architect Herrera for Philip II. And this more or less somber but very pure, not pure, very serious architecture impressed me very much, because that was, I think, that would have been the, so I thought in this time, that would have been the right expression of National Socialism, not this rich, decadent architecture of the 19th century.
The death of this man, Fritz Todt, in a plane crash in 1942, changed Speer's life. Hitler appointed him Todt's successor as Minister for Armaments. So after 9 years as Hitler's architect, he had the job on which Hitler's dreams of world dominion depended, war production. His astonishing achievements made him the second man in the state. Speer says that Hitler's choice of him, an architect, as Minister of Armaments, was part of the dictator's dilettantism. All his life, Hitler had distrusted professionals. After all, he had appointed a former wine salesman, Ribbentrop, foreign minister. A former fighter pilot, Goering, had charge of the economy. Speer claims hardly to have noticed the apparatus of Himmler's SS state by which the dreams of Hitler's robber empire were to be sustained. He was, he says, blindly preoccupied with immediate purpose and his own responsibilities. It was, he says, in retrospect, a grotesque illusion.
You say very little about Himmler, who seems to me so important in Nazi Germany as being the head of the whole apparatus of terror on which the regime ultimately rested. You say that you thought you had possibilities of getting on with Himmler. This is a phrase which rather shook me when I read it. You treat Himmler, when he becomes Minister of the Interior, as simply being a minister with whom you could make a deal. You found it satisfactory to have relations with him. He was the right kind of minister for you. To us who see Himmler in this not as a person, but as the head of this and creator of this terrible organization of extermination and force, this is a shocking remark.
Well, but he, as a Minister of Interior, he was some hope to me that he is the only one who can get order in the Gau leaders. He was, because he was a man who was feared by everybody, even in the party, he could have done it. And it was, in my position as a war minister, it was one of the hopes I had, because those Gau leaders were opposed to me, to my ideas of total warfare, and only with a strong Minister of Interior I could overwhelm them. I was too much of a specialist to think of the other side. I would have, well, it was as someone sometimes makes a deal with the devil to get to some.
So you looked cheerfully forward to an extension of Himmler's control over Germany, provided it were at the expense of that of Bormann.
Yes, I would have liked it if he would have been a strong Minister of Interior, also against the party. I would have liked it.
Herr Speer is regarded, certainly immediately after the war, as the organizational genius who so organized German industry under the bombing that the war was protracted far beyond a length one might have assumed. Do you believe that that stands up in the light of history, Herr Speer's achievement?
Yes, I think it stands up to a very considerable extent. When the bombing survey, of which I was a director, completed its work and we looked at the results, there were two or three questions that we had. One was a proper evaluation of what your predecessor Fritz Todt had done, for example, because a great deal of the kind of infrastructure which you build on seemed to us to have been established by him. From the point of view of the total mobilization of the economy, however, I would think that Germany never went as far as, for example, the United Kingdom or even the United States in the rationalization of production and using all resources that were available to it.
I absolutely agree with you. My point of view was that it wasn't done enough and should have been done much more. And I had all those reports available, what Bevin was doing in the United Kingdom, and one could see that if it would be done in this way in Germany, we could produce much more. That was another point which is going apart from this first answer. Hitler was always afraid to get too many sacrifices from the German people. He was afraid because he had the example of the revolution in 18, and he considered it best to keep the German people in a good mood and not to give him too much of a burden.
Isn't this perhaps a common or almost an implicit defect in a totalitarian system, that the unwillingness of the dictator to ask the people for the kind of sacrifices that they can be asked for in a democratic society?
Yeah, I am not familiar with other authoritarian systems, thank goodness, but I should say in Hitler's system it was quite obvious that he was shrinking away if it was getting too hard for the German people. And I was sometimes saying that the words of Churchill, blood, tear and sweat, that would be the better one for the German people too.
It's this period of your life, of course, that ultimately is to send you to prison for more than 20 years, your association with the slave labor in the German factories. How do you defend that to yourself now?
It can't really be defended, but one should think that I am not responsible, I was not responsible to bringing in those labors, and I was not responsible for their treatment and for the time of working and so, because my ministry was, as in, I think it was similar in the United States with the production ministry, was a new founded ministry and didn't take away from other ministries which were normally in this state working many of those of their tasks. So the Ministry for Labor was still responsible for labor conditions. The Ministry for Interior was responsible for behavior and for punishments, or the Minister of Justice and so on.
But how do you think you might have conducted these responsibilities if you had had them? Would it have been different from the way Sokol did?
It would definitely have been different because, as it is in our files, I was convinced that that we had millions of German women at our disposal, which could have worked in the economy. There was a plan from already before wartime, when the war mobilization was prepared, and in this plan there was more than 5 million of women due to be mobilized in time when war is starting, and nothing happened like that.
Were you completely unmoved by any compassionate feelings for the condition of people in these factories? Because you did tour them from time to time, and you must have seen the condition of the workers in them.
There were 2 points. One point was absolutely a rational one. Those workmen, when they came from abroad, had to be learned, and it needed about 1 or 2 months, and until they were able to do their work, one very a good specialist of the firm had to teach them. So he was lost too for this time. So when the conditions of those workmen were bad and they felt sick, it was really doing much harm to our production. If it happened very often in a factory, it was the danger that the whole production would collapse. That was one point, but the other point, of course, was I was happy to help them, but this was not a point which I stressed too much, and I don't want to stress it now because it would be too much in my favor, I guess, if I'm looking backwards to this period.
Can we come now to the final part, Herr Speer, of your story? And before we deal with the last days of Adolf Hitler, comes this extraordinary volte-face of yours, from your pledged and total allegiance to him throughout the 30s, and as Minister for Armaments during the war. We come to an attempt by you to kill him. Can you tell us why you felt that was necessary, and whether we are to believe that it was a serious attempt to kill Hitler?
It was just an attempt, and I was stopped with the very first step, so it's not really true to say it was getting serious. And it can't be compared with the plot of the 20th of July, because these people of the 20th of July, they really were going to do something against Hitler from an ideological point of view, and not me.
But how was your attempt to kill Hitler to be carried out? What were you going to try and do?
We had 2 new sorts of gas that was taboo and sarin, and Hitler lived in this time in his bunker, and the whole air was getting through air conducts.
Conditioning, yes.
And then through a gas filter, a normal gas filter for normal gas, and but with this other gas would have went through this filter. If I would have succeeded, then Hitler, together with Bormann, Goebbels, and Lai, would have been killed immediately a few seconds afterwards. But it turned out then, it was a first difficulty, that this gas is only effective with, when it's exploding. I tried to get a normal gas, and I convinced the engineer of the Chancellery, which I knew well from the time when I was building it, to build the filter out, and it was also quite logical, because Hitler complained about the bad air in this bunker in this time. Now it was really no more in the filter, and my man in charge of the whole ammunition, he tried hard to get this gas, but it was very difficult. He asked somebody of the armaments office named Soika, the colonel. And then I went in the garden, and there was no more the opening on the level of the garden, but it was a chimney built in order of Hitler. And with this it was no more possible to do this attempt. But it was quite the idea of a technocrat, I guess, to do it this way. But I couldn't have killed Hitler with a pistol shot. I think that's a question which is obvious. That his power to me, over me, would have been too strong.
And so in 1945, Hitler's Germany is taking its final plunge to annihilation. The fate which in 1940 he had exulted would be loosed on London and all his enemies was now visited 100-fold on every major city in Germany. Hitler remained utterly indifferent to these miseries. He delivered a final brutal judgment even on his own people. If Germany lost the war, it need not and should not survive. He gave orders for a scorched earth policy that would finally destroy Germany and the Germans. Hitler's orders for final, massive demolitions were opposed and thwarted by Speer. It led to a macabre face-to-face encounter with Hitler, who demanded a retraction or the consequences of treachery. Albert Speer, the one man with the intellectual integrity to reject Hitler, could not. It's proof of the grip that Hitler had to the very end on the party he had created and the people in it.
Mit dem Führer als Phalanx der Heimat hinter der kämpfenden Wehrmacht stehen, diesen Kampf mit wilder Entschlossenheit und unbeirrt durch alle Schicksalsfügen und fortzusetzen, bis der Sieg in unseren Händen ist.
Speer's personal compact with Hitler was broken only by the leader's death. With Berlin under Russian artillery fire, Speer made a last trip back to Berlin to say goodbye to the man a few months earlier he had tried to kill.
Well, there was a period of almost 2 months between when I had to fight Hitler's ideas of scorched earth politics, and I was betraying him in this time. I was counter-ordering his orders, and I didn't feel too well in this counteracting Hitler even in that time. So it possibly was a partly bad conscience. Possibly it was some other move that I regretted not to have said farewell to Hitler, because he was his architect. Everything was finished now, the whole period was finished. And I was remembering the first years. And but it's also, it's not so easy to explain. I think there are 2 versions. I mentioned why I was going to Berlin, and it's true that those 2 versions are true, and I even could find a 3rd version, which I didn't mention yet.
Well, can you mention it now?
Well, some friend of mine, Roland, he said to me, and he's true, he said, your chances after the war were very low. You didn't know, and we were talking about, I didn't know what will happen with me. Shall I be with the Russians? Shall I be tortured? And so on, and so on. And on the other hand, there was my family, 6 children, and my wife, and my parents living. And if Hitler would have, which was a chance too, would have killed me, as he did with his brother-in-law, Fegelein, a few days before,
Fegelein was the SS adjutant in the Hitler bunker. Hitler had him killed just before the end.
Yeah, then I think it would have been to me a good way out of the situation. The family would have had a good reputation because it was known that they counteracted Hitler, and I would have been dead and would have been spared of many torturing things which could have been ahead of me in future.
Are you, I've not heard this before, are you asking us to believe that you went back to see Hitler supposing that you might in fact be killed and that would solve
No,
no,
it's not consciously done, it's unconsciously a possibility.
Incidentally, you hardly mention your family throughout the course of this long book. You don't mention your wife or your children. Why?
Because my wife and the children were not a part of this political book I wanted to write. She was she didn't want to interfere in my job, and she didn't ask when I was at home. I was so tired that I didn't talk with her about such things. And
you never discussed politics with her?
No,
at home?
No, and
never?
She was no party member and was not in those organizations, none of them. And few weeks after the war, she was got her final papers that she wasn't involved.
Can we have from you a description of this last day? You were at this time outside Berlin in the north, as the armies from the Soviet Union advanced from the east, and at this time the British armies in the north were pushing the survivors of the German government up to the north of Germany, near the Danish border. Can you describe that last day? You had to fly in, didn't you, under anti-aircraft and artillery fire?
I had to fly in, not because Berlin was already surrounded by the troops. There was one way out, but because the traffic was so heavy from Berlin outside that the whole road was filled.
With refugees? With
refugees, yes.
Trying to get to the west?
Yeah. And so I couldn't go any longer to Berlin with my car, and I stopped and went to an airfield where I knew the commander, and he gave me sent a plane to come to Berlin. And in Berlin, I went immediately to the chancellery, and I was, and the adjutant of Hitler, he asked Hitler, and of course I was, and after a few minutes I was down there with Hitler, and had first a private talk with him.
What did he look like?
He looked like a very old man. He was, he looked like that already the last weeks of the war. He was worn out, and he was absent-minded, and but this day he was in some way more peaceful than he was in other times. He was not in a contradictory mood. Now, there was only in these private talks, there was only the question about survival of him or not survival, and he told me that he will end his life, and he told me in the words, he told me that what then happened, that he will shoot himself and that Eva Braun will be killed and so on.
Did he display any emotion to you? How, for example, did he address you?
As usual, Herr Speer.
He never called you by your Christian name the whole time?
No, he wouldn't. No, he was, that was one of those things of Hitler, that he never wanted to have a close approach of anybody. Also, Bormann or Goebbels, all were, he all said to them, Herr Goebbels, or Herr Minister even to the last time. And
how long were you with him on this last occasion?
I don't know how long it lasted, this private conversation, but it didn't last too long, maybe half an hour and so. But then it was interrupted by the conference of the situation, military situation, which was a very poor one. There was only a few officers present, And then he asked me to leave. I don't know what he did then. And afterwards I was free and visited Frau Goebbels and Eva Braun. And
Eva Braun, you say, is not going to be a profitable field for historians suspecting a great romantic figure, that she was certainly not that. And yet you also go at some pains to point out that she alone in Hitler's bunker at the very end was the calmest and most rational person there.
She was, and certainly the wives of others like Frau Goebbels or Frau Göring were more reasonable than their husbands. Maybe women are more rational sometimes than men when they are coming in power.
Your final farewell of Hitler, was it cold?
It was
correct?
Absolutely cold. It was, when I had two farewells. I said farewell to him first when we had finished our situation of the military situation. And he said a farewell as it was normally when I was going away and coming back the next day, just without any emotion. But the second one, then in the morning at 2 o'clock, was obviously very cold and very distant, and possibly he expected that I stay with him, or I don't know. But in any case, he
would you have stayed if he had asked you? Would you have stayed?
No, I wouldn't have liked to stay. To make the thing sure, I wrote to my wife before I went to Berlin a letter and told her that I'm coming back. So I just pay a call to Hitler. I said, maybe I wrote it again in this unconsciously to give her something in her hands that I was not voluntarily staying with Hitler to be killed or to go to death with him.
After you left Hitler in the bunker on this last day, and a few days later, of course, he commits suicide, and you're almost the last person to see him. You go home, and in the book, you go back to the north. You fly out again. By this time, the Chancellor is under artillery fire. Mm-hmm. And you unpack your bag, and you take out of it, almost the first thing is Hitler's portrait. Mm-hmm. And you tell us that you break down and you sob uncontrollably. Mm-hmm. When you see Hitler's
That's right,
photograph.
but I don't think that it was for pity. I was, this day, I was glad that Dönitz was succeeding Hitler, because I thought that this is a reasonable step. It's not one of the party fanatics. And I also was relieved that the thing was coming to an end. But if I was living in such a high tension, I was living in a kind of a schizoid state all these last months, that this breakdown was certainly the consequence of it. But it was not pity with Hitler, certainly not.
I wonder if it was not little more than that, that you felt that the spell with Hitler had been broken.
It's possibly that. I am not really a learned psychologist, but I should say so. It was something I was getting, with his weeping, I was getting rid of the whole thing. I was still in connection with Hitler in some way, but then afterwards I felt sound asleep, and the world after this sleep was another one.
The next day?
Possibly, yes. It was for a long time before, it was already another one, but that was this controversial thing I can't explain, that I was trying to get away and was again brought back in the influence. But then this question was solved.
Didn't you seriously consider flying to Greenland and hiding there in an isolated bay with supplies until the heat had blown over somewhat, and then return?
Yeah, it was. That was. Until now, I regret it, because I think it must be in this time, May and June and July in Greenland must have been a wonderful time, and I always would have liked to be there for a while. I had seen a film of Greenland once, and it must be beautiful there. And then I wanted to start to write my memoirs there.
Was that a serious proposal, though, that people like you should get out of Germany just before the final surrender and go to Greenland?
Yes, the
Yes.
plane was already there. I have seen the plane.
Yes.
It was
And you
watering.
refused to go in the end?
It was watering in, I think in Lübeck it was.
Do you think if you had gone to Greenland, which was a colony of Denmark, which was not neutral in the war, that the Danish government would not have immediately given you up?
No, Greenland was impossible in this time without radar and what we have nowadays to find out some plane which is hiding in some of this
Fjords. And
fjords.
yes.
Because we had during wartime we had always weather stations there in Greenland which were never been discovered. They were there the whole year. The weather that was necessary for the weather forecast when the offensive started was very important to have there such a station. And just this station was always flown there and back by the plane which I had at my disposal. After a few months, we were decided, because we would have run out of food, we were decided to fly back and probably land on the Thames close to London. Would have been quite a surprise.
Schloss Glücksburg, the home of the Duke of Holstein near the Danish border, is where Albert Speer waited for capture at the end of the war and where he was interrogated by George Ball. The British troops and tanks came one morning and took him and the others to whom Hitler had handed power into custody. At Nuremberg, Speer displayed a will to be honest, which then and now is impressive. While he had opposed Himmler's plans for mass deportations of slave labor on tactical grounds because it interfered with production, it was his admitted co-responsibility for its use in the factories which earned Speer his sentence of 20 years.
Was war die Entscheidung Hitlers? Die Sperrbetriebe sollten aufrechterhalten werden und Sauge ließ sich dazu den Auftrag geben, 3,5 Millionen Arbeitskräfte aus den besetzten Gebieten zu holen. Waren Sie mit dieser Entscheidung einverstanden? Nein, keineswegs.
Albert Speer's moral failure, he has said, is not a matter of this item or that. It resided on his active association with the whole course of events, and for which at Nuremberg he assumed a collective moral guilt. At the Nuremberg trial, you accept not only your own guilt, but the guilt of, on behalf of all the top leadership of Nazi Germany. And you tell us too in the foreword to your book how you are haunted by the memories of those days today, and particularly by a film they showed you of Jewish inmates of a concentration camp going to their deaths in Auschwitz. Can you describe that for me, what you saw?
It was not a film, it was a description from some report. And this was really haunting because they were marching to their deaths in a very, not only with courage, but obviously in like the martyrs of the early Christian period. And this gave us more than also numbers. You know, numbers are practically not to realize. If you say 10,000 are murdered or 100,000 or millions, it's getting out of scale, out of what you can really comprehend. Yes, but this was something which I could really realize. But in Nuremberg trial, I avoided the word Gülz. I never mentioned once the word Gülz because I only mentioned responsibility, because in my opinion it was up to the judges to say to change my responsibility in Gülz, and I wouldn't have liked to say as in a show process in Moscow, I am guilty. I never said this.
Has your 20 years in jail allowed you to accept the burden of your own role in the Hitler period?
You mean the sentence, or? Yes, it was already after the Nuremberg trial was finished. And I accepted it not only during these 20 years. Just now, a few months ago, there was the 25th anniversary of the beginning of the trial, and I had to stand before Belgian and German television. And I said the same, that in my case, the judgment is right, because it has nothing to do with politics. If, for instance, I would have succeeded to keep a few workmen in far Alaska, North Alaska, somewhere for a few years, working for me against their own will, every tribunal would give me a sentence of at least some years, or I guess 20 years. I would get just for this, keeping those few people there. And now it was done by me millionfolds and with grave consequences for people. So, in my opinion, and that's what I said on television too, every sentence would have been right. Nevertheless, of course, I had nothing to do with treatment and so on of these people, but I was involved by asking to have them.
But is your life a tranquil life now, or are you haunted by recollections all the time?
I think I got rid of this what happened by writing these books. This happens often, and I'm not haunted at all. I wasn't haunted in Spandau. Sometimes in Spandau I still dreamt about Hitler, but it was always in some way ridiculous what I dreamt about him. And he never was to me then really a person I respected. I don't know why. But now I'm absolutely, that is absolutely past. It's also to me, it's a part of almost history.
I think that looking back on all of this, you've painted a picture today which is quite consistent with certainly what you said in your book. It's quite consistent in the factual details with what you told my colleagues and myself 26 years ago. There are still many problems from the point of view of one who didn't have your experience and didn't, as you say, live within the aquarium. Many problems of trying to comprehend, trying to understand. I wouldn't want to say that for myself that you've cleared up all of those problems today. I don't suppose that it's possible to have that kind of ability to transfer your own experience to somebody else so that things can be seen in those terms. But you're more a moralist and philosopher than I, Professor. No. What did you add?
I feel that I've learnt a great deal of detail, that some minor problems have been resolved, but the great problem to me is insoluble. I don't feel that I am capable of understanding this division of the mind to which Herr Speer frankly confesses and doesn't seek to defend.
Mm-hmm. Well, to me, nowadays it's incomprehensible too, but to try to explain it would only we would only getting farther away from the nucleus of the problem, and the nucleus of the problem is really that I was thinking as a specialist and not thinking as a human being, and I was so specialized in my job as an architect and other ones that I forgot that humanity is a most important part of life.
Today, the foundations Albert Speer designed for Hitler's 1,000-year Reich are tombstones overgrown with weeds.
Of course, I can't say that I am now every day thinking about this burden. I am normally quite serene, and I can laugh and can joke, but it always comes back, and it always will come back to me, as we had it, for instance, in our conversation. Such a conversation is not ended with this conversation. It lasts for weeks and weeks until I overcome what we had to talk today.
Nazis, The Road to Power tells the story of how in just 13 years Hitler led a fringe sect with outlandish ideas to become the dominant force in German politics. Listen on BBC Sounds.